Welcome to the Generation Podcast. I'm Bobby Bosler, and I'm speaking to you today from Menominee Falls, Wisconsin. And you know what, young people, I'll bet you that if you've been following the news, you've noticed some things. And while my purpose here is certainly not to talk politics, I really honestly want to avoid that as much as possible. There are some topics that are unavoidable here in our society, at least here in America. For those of you that don't know, this past Tuesday, or whenever it is you're listening, Tuesday, November 3rd, the United States of America went to the polling locations. Many of them had voted ahead of time, and many went in to make their vote for the President of the United States. And what's interesting to me is the two party leaders, the two men who were on the ballot, represented very different worldviews. One man, President Donald Trump, though certainly has his faults and his own pride issues, was a man who stood with the nation of Israel. He was a man who promised to defend the rights of the unborn. He's a man who promised to defend the religious liberty in the country of America. He's a man who promised to defend the Second Amendment, the right of Americans given in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights to defend themselves using arms if necessary. And on the other side of the ticket, however, was Vice President Joe Biden. Here was a man who essentially said that he does not believe in the rights of the unborn. He's fine with a mother, because of her own selfishness, choosing to murder a baby just moments before the time of birth. He is fine with destroying the freedom of speech in the name of the moral revolution. This is a man who is not for peace in Israel, but instead wants to handle those things in a way that would not be considered blessing God's people. And I say all of that to say America made a choice. And regardless of whether you think the election was fair or whether all the votes were valid, that remains to be seen here at this point. There's one thing that you cannot avoid noticing, and that is that tens and tens and tens of millions of people voted for the second candidate, Vice President Joe Biden. And you know, to be honest with you, the state of our country, the fact that many people could vote for a man who is totally fine with mothers murdering their own children, that's a very sobering fact, is it not? And while it would be very easy to despair, it'd be very easy to be discouraged, it'd be very easy to give up on our mission, I want you to know, young people, the very fact that we have 70 plus million people who have such an unbiblical worldview, it's a rebuke to you and to me. In fact, it is a call to the urgency of our mission, young people. I'll be honest with you, I don't know what's going to happen as far as the final outcome of the election, but I will tell you this. If the Senate changes hands and if the presidency changes parties to the Democratic Party, I'm just going to say this, and listen, if you're listening and you have voted Democrat and you believe that Joe Biden was the man for the hour because of the imperfections of President Donald Trump, if you believe what many in the media have said about President Trump or President Biden for that matter, I want you to know that's not my point here today. But I think one thing is very clear. Coming up in the coming days and weeks and years ahead, if things continue in their present course, we could be criminals. We could be criminals for preaching the gospel. The supposed tolerance of those on the left will not tolerate our belief in Jesus Christ and our belief that Jesus has called us and commissioned us to preach the gospel to every creature. There will come a day when you could go to jail for telling someone that their sin will send them to hell. You could get slapped with a massive fine and lose your job because you say that it's wrong for a woman to take the life of her baby in her womb. And you know, young people, that is a very sobering reality. And one of the things that I want to challenge you with here is, what are you going to do about it? Because I'm going to tell you, in the days and months ahead, there are going to be a couple of temptations. On the one hand, there's going to be a temptation to handle this humanly In other words, there could be a number of different things that you're encouraged to do. And listen, I'm not against political involvement necessarily, but the temptation is going to be to alter our mission, to change the political landscape of our country. And I want you to know, young people, that's the wrong mission. Our great need, the great need of our country, is not to get somebody into the White House who will rule with biblical principles. Our mission is not to get somebody into the Senate or into the House of Representatives. That's not our mission. Our mission is to reach the world with the gospel. In fact, like I said a moment ago, the very fact that there are so many people who have such an unbiblical worldview tells me that there is a great need for our mission to be done and completed in the power of God. Romans chapter 1 and verse 1, Paul introduces himself to a group of people that didn't know him very well, and he said, Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated unto the gospel of God. And here in this verse, I find three very interesting factors here. Paul was a man who was about his Father's business. He was not living his life for himself, for his own comfort, for his own dreams or plans. He describes himself as a servant, a slave of Jesus Christ. And frankly, young people, if we're going to make a difference in our world that's getting worse more and more quickly, we're going to have to enslave ourselves to God. We can't just dabble at being a member of the generation. We can't just kind of mess around during certain periods of time at trying to accomplish parts of God's mission. That isn't going to work, young people. We have to become a slave. A slave doesn't have downtime. A slave doesn't have a right to determine what he wants to do with his day. A slave is completely at the disposal of his master. And young people, it's about time that we stopped messing around with being Christians and with serving God. And it's time that we completely place ourselves at the beck and call of our master, Jesus Christ. But that's not all that he said. He said, a servant of Jesus Christ called to be an apostle. While God has called every one of us to enslave ourselves to him, God also has a specific track for each one of us to run. He's got a specific job for each of us to accomplish. And he says at the end of this verse, separated unto the gospel of God. Now, regarding that first part, the call to be an apostle, young people, you can't be a slave of Jesus and resist the specific call of God on your life. I may be speaking to some young people who are listening to this podcast. You know full and well what God wants for you to do, but you've not been willing to do it. You've not been willing to hear God's specific call on your life, and you've not been willing to surrender to it. And can I say this as kindly as I know how, young people? And again, this is going to come across very abrasive, but just hear me out for a second. It is people like you that are the problem with Christianity. Did you hear me? Please don't stop the podcast. Hear me out here for just a second. But it's my contention that our country wouldn't be in the mess that it's in right now if God's people would unconditionally surrender, not just to this general concept of serving God, but to the specific mission that God has for them. It's time that we stop messing around, young people. Listen, if God's called you to preach, do it. Be public about it. Tell God, I'll go where you want me to go. I'll say what you want me to say. I'll be what you want me to be. Young person, if God's calling you to be a missionary, please stop fighting it. Our country is in the state that it's in because our parents and those that have gone before us have not done what God has wanted them to do. They've run from the call of God to make money, to marry the person they wanted to marry, to do what they've always dreamed of doing. They've sacrificed the future of our country and our world for some stupid hobby or dream. And young people, it's got to stop. Listen, we need to be slaves to Jesus Christ. We need to surrender to God's call on our lives. And thirdly, we need to be separated unto the gospel of God. See, when you say yes to a call, you're saying no to a whole lot of other things. And Paul here is saying, in essence, there are a lot of things I could do with my life. I could have continued on in my dream to be a Pharisee, perhaps even a member of the Sanhedrin. If he was not that in his life, I could have been famous among my people. I could have had it all. I could have been so greatly respected. But God had a different plan for my life. To say yes to God's call is to say no to a whole lot of things that you could be doing otherwise. Listen, young people, are you saying no to things that don't fit in with your call? Are you saying no to all of the extraneous things that are beating down the door of your life? Do you say no to that social media feed when you ought to be praying or seeking God's face or sharing the gospel with somebody? Or does your phone dominate your day instead of God's will? The song says, "Rise up, O men of God, have done." In other words, be finished with lesser things. And young people, that I think is one of the greatest things that we need to consider here during this day. Listen, I understand the temptation, and I've been there and I've failed at it, even in the last several days, because I want to know what's happening, and I want to refresh the feeds to find out what the latest development is in the whole political situation. But young people, are you saying yes to what God wants for you, not just for your life, but for today, for the next 10 minutes? Are you listening to the voice of the Spirit of God, and are you obeying Him? Listen, you are the light of the world, and you are the hope of the United States of America or whatever country you're in. And young people, as I've said several times before in this podcast, it's time that we stopped messing around and that we get serious. That we get serious about doing what God wants us to do. Listen, our land is not beyond hope yet, but I'm wanting you to know the light at the end of the tunnel seems like it's getting farther and farther away. And I really do believe that the reason why is because we have not been doing what we ought to be doing. So take this as a sober challenge, young people. Surrender to God. Obey Him day by day. Enslave yourself to the will of God. And I believe that if we'll surrender to God and if we'll depend on His power, we will turn the world upside down with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Thanks for listening.